With another podium finish under his belt this season and a very broken teammate after the Baku Grand Prix weekend, has George Russell done what has seemingly been impossible in replacing Lewis Hamilton as that #1 driver in the Mercedes team? Or has the young British driver been quite lucky over the course of the 2022 season so far? Let's look at the statistics, let's delve into it, and see whether George Russell is the real deal or whether he's actually just got quite lucky over the course of the season so far. First off though, let's add a little bit of context to this Mercedes season so far. Currently sitting third place in the Constructors' Championship, but this 2022 season has been plagued by porpoising issues. That word that seemingly was invented about 4 months ago to describe this bouncing up and down of Formula One cars. And the frustration for Mercedes has been that it looked like they were getting on top of this issue. They've slowly been making progress towards getting a balance in that car that looked correct. And then we got to Barcelona, huge upgrade packages for lots and lots of the teams. And it looked like Mercedes had finally fixed that issue, especially in Sector 1 and Sector 2 at Barcelona. The car looked really smooth. It was that final sort of slower sector where George Russell was still struggling and Lewis Hamilton couldn't quite get it together. But after Barcelona, we were expecting them to be a lot quicker than they have been, but problems with slow speed corners continued into the Monaco Grand Prix weekend, and we saw that Mercedes car struggle with the slower speeds of the Monaco track over the course of that entire Grand Prix. And then, of course, we moved into Baku, and we thought maybe Baku would suit the Mercedes car a little bit more. In fact, we probably saw the worst porpoising from the car we've seen over the entire season. We could see Lewis Hamilton hop, skipping, and jumping through that final sector, trying to wrestle the car towards the racing line as it was trying to slip away from him pretty much every single lap at those super high speed corners towards the end. And it's not like they are right at the top and he has to deal with this bouncing and he's winning Grand Prix. They're still so far off the Ferraris and the Red Bulls. And actually, if you look at it in terms of the Constructors' Championship, as I touched on, Mercedes are in third place, and actually they kind of find themselves in this no man's land. They should probably actually be closer to the Ferraris and Red Bulls in front, because both Ferrari and Red Bull have had reliability issues this year, but Mercedes have actually finished every single Grand Prix that we've gone to so far. But they're too far away from McLaren to be deemed as a midfield team as well. So the problem that Mercedes have is they're nowhere near competitive with Ferrari or Red Bull as of yet, but also they're miles ahead of the competitors in the midfield. So the only thing that you can actually do is compare George Russell to Lewis Hamilton, which we're going to do today. We're going to see if George Russell and Lewis Hamilton, in comparison to one another, are where they should be. So let's dive into exactly that. Let's talk about points to begin with, because George Russell right now sitting in 4th place in the championship, 99 points so far this season. Lewis Hamilton in 6th place with 62 points. And actually the Mercedes team, as I touched on, they haven't had the reliability issues of some of the other cars around them, and therefore they've been able to finish every single Grand Prix, meaning that they've been able to pick up points pretty much every single race this year. Obviously, George Russell has that top 5 finish record that continues on even after 8 Grand Prix this year. And that means that his average finishing position sits him at a 4.0. He pretty much finishes 4th in every single race this year, whereas Lewis Hamilton a 6.63, putting them 5th and 6th right now in terms of their average finishing position. That does mean George Russell is actually in 4th place in the Drivers' Championship, but would be expected to be 5th right now. That just shows the reliability issues that Carlos Sainz has had and the mistakes that Carlos Sainz has had that has opened the door a little bit for George Russell this season so far. And if we look at the cumulative points so far this season, we can see that George Russell actually took over Lewis Hamilton at the Saudi Arabian Grand Prix. Lewis Hamilton had a pretty poor weekend that weekend, and since then George Russell has just run away with it, being in and amongst it with Carlos Sainz, getting in front of Carlos Sainz and actually staying in front of Carlos Sainz for the majority of this season as well. Now, some people put this points gap between the two Mercedes drivers completely down to luck on George Russell's part this season, which I think is a little bit harsh, but even Toto Wolff said himself, so once these unlucky situations stop with Lewis, they're very much on the same pace. So even Toto Wolff thinks that his two drivers are pretty much on the same level right now, and had it not been for the unlucky situations of Lewis and a little bit of luck for George Russell, they'd probably be a little bit closer in terms of points. And I can kind of see where he's coming from. You know, Australia in particular, Seb with the safety car coming out just at the right time. He's able to leapfrog Lewis Hamilton under the safety car because he's able to pit with those safety car conditions. And similar with Miami as well, went super long on those tyres, was having a really tough weekend in Miami, and it just clicked together just at the right time. Got that safety car just as he needed it, but he rolled the dice on that and he was able to bump himself up into 5th because of that safety car on probably the toughest weekend he's had in the year. I think if there's one Grand Prix where he didn't quite deserve to finish in that top 5 as he continues that top 5 streak, it's probably the Miami Grand Prix for me. And I think on top of that, he's got a little bit lucky with the podiums that he's picked up. All of the podiums that he's had so far this season have come when either Charles Leclerc, Carlos Sainz, or both Ferraris have dropped out of the Grand Prix. And it's interesting that he's picked up his podiums when the Ferraris have dropped out of the Grand Prix, whereas Lewis Hamilton picked up his podium when the Red Bulls dropped out of the Grand Prix. But George Russell himself said, he's been a little bit lucky, but you've got to be in it to win it, and he's capitalised on others' misfortune. And we often praise drivers for capitalising on others' misfortune, but I think on top of that, not only has he been lucky, he's also been very, very good in some of these races too. For me, I'd say he's had 3 exceptional drives this season. Imola in particular, during that race where it looked like Mercedes just weren't able to find an overtaking opportunity. It was super difficult to overtake. He was able to get some really good moves early on in that Grand Prix and just settle himself into the race, even under wet conditions. Then we moved on to Spain. I think Spain is probably his best performance so far this year. Yes, I know Max Verstappen didn't have DRS, but he was still fighting a Red Bull that is massively, massively outpacing the Mercedes right now. He was showing that tenacity, showing that side-by-side, that wheel-to-wheel action that we haven't been able to see from George Russell over his 3 years in Williams too much, to be honest with you. And that's still a question mark that a lot of people have over him. But I think we saw that, in that Spanish Grand Prix, he was able to hold his own against Max Verstappen, go wheel-to-wheel with him and show exactly why he's in that Mercedes team right now. And actually, I think Azerbaijan was a pretty good race from him overall. As I talked about, the porpoising from the Mercedes car was probably the worst we've seen over the season so far. Still came away with a podium, finished 25 seconds up the road from his teammate in Lewis Hamilton, and I think had a really, really good weekend considering the struggles that Mercedes had in Azerbaijan. But yes, he's been very lucky. I do completely understand that, but I often think that he deserves his luck a little bit, especially because of the lap times that he's been putting in both qualifying and in the races as well. Because if we do look at qualifying, George Russell's currently 5-3 in the lead when it comes to qualifying positions over the course of this season so far. And since Australia, it's been very, very close between the two of them. And you know what? I think the main thing that stands out from me is not how close it is, but the fact that George Russell now has 3 in a row in terms of qualifying. It was alternating between the two over the course of the season, but Barcelona, Monaco, and Azerbaijan, he's able to come out on top. And 3 very different circuits. Barcelona, very technical. Obviously, all the drivers know it like the back of their hand. Monaco, super technical as well, but super slow speed and very difficult to get those corners right, because one mistake and you're completely out of the Grand Prix and out of qualifying itself. And then, of course, Azerbaijan, which kind of has the opposite. There's the same jeopardy as Monaco. You can hit a wall and be out of it completely, but super high speed and really difficult braking zones to judge. And the fact that George Russell's outdone Lewis Hamilton on all 3 of those, and that's bumped his average qualifying position up. We look at the average qualifying position for George Russell, 7.38 compared to Lewis Hamilton's 8.25. You can see how George Russell's just starting to eke out a little bit of a lead and qualifying just that position ahead of Lewis Hamilton pretty much every single time round. And then it comes to race pace, where George Russell again is 5-3 in the lead in terms of fastest laps that they've been able to do under racing conditions, although their race pace has been pretty comparable when they've been in free air. And I think that's the thing. Lewis Hamilton has often been stuck by a Fernando Alonso, a Yuki Tsunoda over the course of the season so far, whereas George Russell, because of those qualifying performances, has been able to push himself up that little bit, get that little bit of extra free air, and be able to put in those slightly better lap times in terms of the race. And I think the main thing is Lewis is always going faster on the straights, but loses so much time in the corners in comparison to George Russell, because he's going into those corners at a lot more stable a speed, a lot slower a speed on the straights, but he's just coming out of the corners with a lot more momentum behind him. And I think that's probably a downforce thing. I think that's a stability thing that he's asked for. George Russell obviously prefers a car that has that little bit of extra downforce. He can trust a little bit more through the corners, whereas with the car bouncing around right now, Lewis Hamilton is still struggling to get around those corners, where the bouncing is probably slightly less for George Russell because he's running that higher downforce, that slightly slower car on the straight. It's just working for him in particular this season so far, whereas the car definitely isn't working for Lewis Hamilton right now, and that's pushed George Russell over the edge. On top of the luck, I think he's been incredibly talented over the course of this season so far, and he's deserved to be in front of Lewis Hamilton in the standings right now. So there you have it, the context, the stats. Do you think George Russell is lucky? Let me know in the comments down below, because I personally think absolutely not. Yes, he's got lucky on a couple of occasions, and yes, things have gone his way, but I think he deserves the fact that he's got lucky in those races. I think Miami is the only one where it's been a huge swing for him. The other ones, he's deserved to be there. He's qualified exceptionally well over the course of the season. He's got on top of this car a little bit better than Lewis Hamilton. I think mainly because he's a little bit younger, yes. I think that bouncing in particular really has affected Lewis Hamilton and his overall physical health, we could see after the Baku Grand Prix. You've got to remember, George Russell's a lot younger, a lot fresher, will have more of an ability to deal with that bouncing. But not only that, he's set up the car a little bit better for himself. He's not too worried about that performance when it comes to the overall top line speed, whereas Lewis Hamilton is. You've seen better cornering from George Russell. We've seen more momentum carried through those corners from George Russell. And I think, honestly, George Russell is the real deal. I think he is now looking at the end of the season, if he outperforms Lewis Hamilton to this extent over the entire year, being the number one at Mercedes going into that 2023 season. Why not? He's come through at Williams. He was incredibly good at Williams, and now he's stepped up and is hugely impressive in a Mercedes team for me. But that's just my thoughts. As I said, let me know in the comments down below. Am I just a delusional British fan? Probably. Whilst you're down there, leave a like, subscribe if you are new to the channel, and I'll see you next time.